So I want to begin with a little preamble of sorts to situate this talk within the development of my larger project. So this talk is a first attempt to sort of move out of the ethnographic specificity of the PhD project. So I'm actually not going to be talking too much about the FEMA trailers. And I'm not going to be talking about tracking these toxic spaces across the country for my doctoral work. And I'm not going to also talk about my postdoctoral work, which was about a participatory design project involving community groups in northeastern Pennsylvania that were living on fracking fields and developing ways with them to better understand the environmental hazards of their air. I'm not going to be talking about that.
Those all sound really interesting.
And I think that's sort of the point, is they do sound really interesting. And I think that's sort of the distraction from the other important things that I think I'll talk about today. And a lot of the things I've been missing in doing that work. And I think sort of to exemplify, I guess here's an image from the fracking fields and visualizing off-gassing VOCs from a storage tank. I'm also not going to be talking about some work that I've been doing on developing plant-based air filtering systems for people that are enduring chronic formaldehyde exposure in their homes. And so just this morning I actually woke up to an email of someone who in Florida who downloaded plans I put up online and has been using them to build this air filtration system in her own home, and she found that there was a 78% reduction in formaldehyde levels, which is double what it was for the previous prototype. And she also found that, or she sees a visible decrease in like the aberrations on her body. So this is her mother's leg before and after. And I think these are really exciting projects. But I think that, I think it's really exciting that we can interrupt and dilute systematic exposures with $20 worth of readily available materials. But when you do remediation with the plant filter systems, the exposures persist, and remediation is a tool for endurance of the infrastructures of exposure just as much as they are a tool of endurance for the people that are exposed to chemicals. So they enable the continuance of the infrastructures of formaldehyde distribution and use at the same time as alleviating some sort of immediate ethical obligation I feel to the people I talk to. So in this talk, I want to pull out of the ethnographic scale where I feel most comfortable and to think on a longer time frame about how toxins come to roost in our everyday ecologies and how, if at all, they can be ushered away. Admittedly, this is in the very uncomfortable process of inflating doctoral work into a book. So if I'm too lofty in how I'm inflating, please take aim. And so I've been organizing this book, and in the last week, I've been organizing around the concept of industrializing the American atmosphere. And so this talk will contribute both to the very beginning and the very end, as this talk is about how the making of and the unmaking of industrialized atmospheres. So here, the chemical flux is the crux. My chemical of choice is formaldehyde, which is neither unique to late industrialism, nor is it a so-called golden spike, marking a global geological force of humanity or capitalism. It wafts through remote air in high levels due to snowpack phytochemistry. It is buried deep in cellular function of mammalian bodies and is emitted in low levels in human breath and off-gas from felled timber. Geophysicists are speculating that interstellar formaldehyde may be the source of organic carbon solids in our solar system, and thus the foundation for biotic life on this planet. While not of exclusively anthropogenic origin, human bodies have been particularly infused with this chemical over the past century. And formaldehyde's distribution is neither even nor benign. Further, the chemical is an irritant, an allergen, a neurotoxin, and a known human carcinogen. It is both a physiological necessity and a pathological threat. Ironically, it it decomposes human bodies, but on average of 3.5 gallons of formaldehyde is injected into the veins of the dead to fend off post-mortem decomposition. The chemical chemically tugs Americans towards death and then defends their inanimate bodies from biological disintegration. The removal of biotic life to maintain immaculate form. And for the past 30 years or so, governmental regulators and exposed communities across the United States have struggled to dismantle the vast infrastructures that keep formaldehyde vapor suspended within human breathing spaces. So in this talk, I'm going to query the political implications and regimes of capital accumulation that inform and emerge out of the different ways formaldehyde is being evacuated from our American airspace. So in terms of the structure of this talk, I'll first give a sort of a rather sketchy and expedited overview of the rise of this chemical and its imbrication into our physical, fiscal, and imaginative infrastructure, before exploring the sorts of chemo-capital futures that are being rendered by the ways in which we are excising formaldehyde from the chemical ecologies and domestic atmospheres of the home. So if we want to talk about the idea of ecological successions, if we want to apply the idea of ecological succession to industrial chemistry, we can begin in very broad brush terms in the stretch of the Mississippi River that snakes between Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and New Orleans. Beginning in the late 1700s, the river began to be, reshaped as bayous, back swamps, and floodplains were drained, shored up with levees, and cultivated into sugar, indigo, and cotton plantations by means of course, exploited and alienated slave labor. Then as the Civil War cut off the supply of free labor, that stretch experienced a protracted transition from plantation ecologies to slavery economies. From the plantation ecologies and slavery economies to petroleum production in the early sort of 1910s. This is pivoting from primarily a labor subsidy to an environmental subsidy. That's here. Plantation-era patterns of land ownership facilitated the swift acquisition of agricultural land by the oil industry and was able to be purchased in large swaths. So they could purchase large swaths of land very easily from these former white plantation owners. And so this is going to be a little bit of a meta-narrative throughout the talk. So it was early in the industrial transition that formaldehyde was first isolated, some 4 years after the Civil War. Yet it was not until 1889 that it began to be industrially produced, first in Germany, and then it was first began to be produced in 1904 in Philadelphia, New Jersey, primarily used for a fixative and a preservative. But within a year of the beginning of the production of formaldehyde, the National Funeral Directors Association was already publishing embalming fluid recipes that included formaldehyde as the primary ingredient. And then between 1914 and 1939, formaldehyde production increased 16-fold, particularly for resins like Bakelite. Sorry, I pronounced it wrong. And so Bakelite is made from a formaldehyde phenol resin and is heralded as the first fully synthetic plastic. And its inventors been dubbed the father of the plastics industry. So in terms of the succession of plastic, it's sort of a crux. So it was first a material for crafting the possibility of mass production, and its industrial applications in machine components became a household name. An unremittingly glamorous skin of luxury goods that were suddenly at a middle-class price point. A perfect machine-aged material evocative of unearthly beauty. And it was also during this period, to return to the Mississippi River, that in 1927, shale oil began to usher in a large-scale industry change. They sought to capitalize the waste of petroleum through the cracking process, and used all of the other things produced in the cracking process to begin to be used as feedstocks for chemicals. So it's the movement from the petroleum industry to the petrochemical industry, and that was in 1927. And the competitors to Shell sort of followed suit. So first, formaldehyde was formed through the destructive distillation of hardwood trees. So you see formaldehyde is up here on the methanol branch. So even before oil, So this is an imaginary of industrial production that doesn't need petroleum necessarily, but that shift did happen in this process of succession. So this was a time when the world-making power of chemists was held in particularly high esteem. Products like formaldehyde-dependent Bakelite were advertised as better materials than any which nature had unaided provided. And they were pioneer species of the plastic age and mid-century agricultural cum petrocultural dream worlds. They represented technological optimism and a liberation through consumption. But the chemical formaldehyde infused the home also in much more pervasive and much less visible ways. Chemists were imagining the replacement of glass with urea formaldehyde, and admiring the stability, fire resistance, and antifungal properties of Bakelite. Chemists at Corning Glassworks in the 1930s were using phenol formaldehyde to bond fiberglass insulation. Still the industry practice, so the pink stuff that you see as fiberglass insulation is bonded with formaldehyde. But more than its use in insulation and adhering carpets to their backing and keeping your permanent press fabrics wrinkle-free and maintaining the spring in increasingly popular foam mattresses and yielding the dimensional stability of precision parts in your faucet or fortifying the surfaces of your kitchen counter, formaldehyde very literally gives form to the average American home as the keystone binding agent of engineered woods that are holding together this podium as well. Both materials, Bakelite, and engineered woods, had ecological justifications in addition to economic ones. So Bakelite, replacement for ivory, and engineered woods were a use of scrap wood that would otherwise could be thrown out. Right. I guess this is just the transition from hardwoods to the cracking process. So it's a derivative of natural gas through methanol to formaldehyde. So it also links my work in fracking fields of natural gas extraction. Formaldehyde-based adhesives hold together plywood or oriented strand board walls, particle board subfloors, hardboard cabinetry, laminate flooring, medium-density fiberboard, and medium-density fiberboard shelves. All of these materials slowly exhale chemical vapors into interior breathing space, and without a cracked window, an open door, or other forms of air exchange, silent and invisible formaldehyde microemissions accrue within the envelope of the home. And indeed, the average home maintains indoor formaldehyde levels capable of, at the very least, inducing irritation. This chemical has also been dubbed the most prevalent indoor air contaminant, and we spend 90% of our time indoors. So it's a very apt lens for reflecting upon the industrialization of the atmospheres. This is the chemical that we breathe in most often that is perhaps most unique to this. Oh, it's the toxicant rather, that we breathe in most often. That is a sort of a residue of industrialism. So, of course, the American home wasn't always held together in this way. And as the conquest of Douglas fir peeler tree forests of the American Northwest escalated, plywood emerged as a commercial building product in about 1905, a year after the initiation of U.S. formaldehyde production. Yet at this point, formaldehyde was largely held together with animal-based glues rendered from the excesses of industrial animal farming, or agriculturally produced glues like soy, which are actually making a comeback for some reasons we'll talk about later. While both forms of adhesion held different affordances, both the protein-based animal glues and the starch-based vegetable glues were subject to biological decomposition, slowly loosening their bonds and delaminating the perpendicularly stacked slabs of wood that make up plywood. So that's why people use plywood, is because you resist warping because the grains are perpendicular. So here's some early production in the Northwest, women in the factory, and we'll get there in just a second. It took some 30 years before the lessons of Bakelite, Bakelite's formaldehyde phenol resin, made their way into the forest products industry in the mid-1930s to create the modern exterior grade plywood that was both completely waterproof and resistant to the agents of rot, which are bacterial, fungal, insect, worms, and heat. Instead of mechanically bonding like a glue, the phenol formaldehyde polymerization fused the resins and wood fibers into an irreversible grip that industry gloated was, quote, pound for pound, the strongest material in the world. Industry soon added urea formaldehyde bonded resins to their plywood arsenal. This resin could not resist decay quite as well, but it was significantly cheaper. And so it was also applicable for indoor applications, like you see here. As returned servicemen streamed back to the States, the single-family detached housing market was quickly oversaturated with demand, and new construction skyrocketed. Engineered woods enabled the construction of 15 million homes in the 1950s, and the relatively large boards required less skilled labor, so there's a de-skilling of the construction force. Imagine the different kinds of skill needed to make a plaster wall versus putting this up. And it also cut in half the amount of nails required. The square footage of structural plywood incorporated into the average home more than quintupled from 1950 to 1992, and usage of particle board, another engineered wood used from even more likely to be wasted wood, increased 3,000% between 1950 and 1992. To ensure the bottom would not drop out of this construction boom, the Federal Housing Administration significantly liberalized their mortgage terms, increasing the maximum payback term from 20 years to 30 years in 1948, and thus decreasing the monthly payments. In 1956, they decreased the minimum down payment from 20% to 5% for new construction and 10% for existing homes. What could be considered the birth of the contemporary mortgage industry began a year later when the Mortgage Guarantee Insurance Corporation allowed lenders to make even riskier loans than those offered by the Federal Housing Administration. Okay, I was a little sleepy. We're going to speed up a little bit. So as the chemical ecologies of the home were swiftly increasing their ambient formaldehyde load due to off-gassing from engineered woods, so too were home ownership rates, which roughly doubled between 1940 and 1980. As polymerized wood products subsidized the post-war spike in home construction and ownership, we can understand the formaldehyde-based resins that held together the post-war home to be material co-constituents of the fiscal instrument of the American mortgage, in addition to the recited forces of policy, social imaginaries, and demographics. I decided not to double space for some reason, so I'm going to have to read this pretty closely. I'm sorry. So as domestic atmospheres progressively hung heavier with the chemical, so too did homeowners shoulder an increasing mortgage debt burden relative to total household income. Mortgage debt was 20% of household income at mid-century and nearly tripled to over 70% of household income, so 20 to 70% by the turn of the millennium. This intensifying toxicity of the home serves as a portent or material metaphor to the intensifying toxicity of loans that can help us understand a capitalism in which the housing market is both a foundation and a brittle linchpin, the increasingly dominant reservoir of capital and a financial sinkhole. That indebtedness became a social good in the form of home ownership and through the stabilization of certain fiscal and housing markets. This process was due in part to the corrosive material, and understanding this linkage helps us to understand how the intimate imbrication of toxic loans and toxic homes plays out. So another way of thinking about this is to harken back to Walter Benjamin's concise summary of the connection between the material constituents of the built environment and dream worlds. Quote, "Construction plays the role of the subconscious." The context of his assertion was the advances in iron forging and glass production that facilitated the construction of miles of arcades in mid-19th century Paris. Arcades consisted of passageways which embraced by long iron archways and which protected from the elements, but it also enabled it to be naturally lit, as there was glass hanging over the iron. Lined with boutiques, arcades layered an expansion of what is technically and materially possible on top of avenues of upscale commerce. So I hazard the dangling assertion. If iron in the form of arcades fueled the commercial dream worlds of the mid-19th century France, and woods supplied the tinder for the domestic fantasies of both of the mid-20th century US. Engineered woods were both manifestations of and springboards for the fanciful realities of 1950s domesticity. Nowhere were engineered woods more prevalent and the sales increasing faster than in the mobile home. The factory-built home represented both the ultimate industrialization of home construction and, through its affordability, the democratization of home ownership. Some more pictures of just the amount of engineered woods used mid-century in the home. And here is a mobile home sort of shrine that I encountered in rural Texas at a FEMA trailer reselling agency, mobile home dealer, I guess that's another way of saying it. And his mother was Miss Mobile Home 1952, and this was sort of the shrine to a mobile home called the Futuro, and sort of a manifestation of these forces I'm talking about. So after the war, the single-family detached housing market became oversaturated, and veterans with new families streamed into mobile homes. The wide varieties of Americans that inhabited trailers in the war effort helped to transform the mobile home market in the national imagination from a dwelling of the itinerant fringe to a legitimate residential alternative. But as the mainstays of low to moderate income homeownership were also almost exclusively constructed from engineered woods, bear limited ventilation, and have less interior airspace to dilute outgassing construction materials, these homes also harbor upwards of 4 times the ambient formaldehyde loads of conventional homes. So domestic formaldehyde first began to percolate up as an issue of concern in the late 1970s following a wave of mobile home-related illnesses. Residential chemical outcry was largely a working class affair and external to the mounting middle-class environmental movement that held a conception of nature that did not include domestic chemical ecologies and of the built environment. I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to talk about regulation for a little while. I don't want to do this. Yeah. So this is for you. I dedicate the following 2 pages. So it was during this time that the EPA was coming to the realization that landmark environmental legislation like the Clean Water Act and the Federal Water Pollution Act of 1972 and the Safe Water Drinking Act of 1974 were dealing with the problem at the point where contaminants are very difficult to control. By the time toxicants in public airs or waters accumulated to the extent that they beckoned the attention of regulators, parsing the responsibility of individual contributors or prioritizing interventions became a Sisyphean task. The traditional loci of environmental regulation, a discrete number of monolithic industrial facilities, were insufficient sites of intervention to affect the steady flow of toxicants into the human and extrahuman environment. These regulatory shortcomings gave rise to the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA, which is the backbone of the U.S. toxics regulation. And compared to previous legislation, the pivot of TSCA is not just a move from focusing on errant emissions at the site of production to the everyday toxic potential of commodities that populate the world, but an attempt to grapple with the risky substances as they outmaneuver legislation that slices America into air, water, and soil, and draws a line in the sand between human and environmental impacts. TSCA traverses media along with potentially toxic molecules that pay no attention to human categorization. But as former director of the EPA's Office of Toxic Substances, Don Clay, succinctly notes in an oral history conducted by Jody Roberts, who's at the back of the room, quote, a toxicant has got to be in something before it can be regulated by TSCA, so it only regulates commodities, basically. So the commodity limit enables the agility of this law and also defines its limit. Through the conceptual, although never conceptualized as such, by the EPA, TSCA's commodity limit was encountered early on in the regulations enacted. Basically, the formaldehyde was the first test of TSCA, and if you go into the oral histories, you find the regulators both excited and terrified about the implementation of this legislation, as they were told to make formaldehyde a priority for the agency. Some people were saying, do we have to have a report by tomorrow? Do we pull all-nighters at EPA? But the terror and exhilaration of implementing this new law were quickly subdued into the sort of politico-bureaucratic purr of the agency. As indoor air is conditioned by a myriad of products and construction materials, it wasn't really clear who exactly would be regulated. Would it be the chemical producers, the plywood manufacturers, the architect, the construction contractors? And for this reason, and also taking into consideration some sustained closed-door conversations with the formaldehyde industry, the EPA decided not to regulate. Clay, who I quoted earlier, made the announcement on national radio, was yelled at by a mobile home manufacturer, and the issue quietly faded into the background. So regulating the chemical transition from a pressing immediacy to an impossibility. Although formaldehyde's role in immobilizing, adhering, hardening, painting, lacquering, disinfecting, laminating, and reinforcing, I really love lists, I'm sorry. The home was no longer under direct threat of regulation. Its vulnerability was increasing as it became recognized as the apex toxicant of indoor atmospheres. The compound's intractability and its potential undoing lay in the ubiquity of this invisible gas. The velocity of wounding, which is durative and subtle enough to go unnoticed for long stretches of time, also facilitates its continued prevalence. If anything, nosebleeds are among the most eventful manifestations of harm spurred by formaldehyde-laden atmospheres. More often than not, such exposures drive gradual enervation, a warping of expected material and biotic functioning, rather than an overt hemorrhaging or breakdown, more surreal and exhausting than directly lethal. As a result, domestic atmospheres represent the largest unregulated airspace in the country. So scientific imperceptibility is no doubt important in understanding the uneventfulness of chemical wounding, but the issues exceed technical histories. Commonplace corrosive exposures fail to crest cultural horizons of significance. Technical accounts are but one facet of coalescing phenomena into a socially recognizable event. For almost 3 decades, the potential crisis of indoor formaldehyde has emerged with an episodic frequency. European and Middle Eastern chemists writing about formaldehyde in the indoor environment in the journal Chemical Reviews noted that, quote, every few years the formaldehyde discussion in the United States is resuscitated, end quote. Every few years the domestic chemical exposures break into the discursive foreground, only to be quelled by perfunctory reviews, or more often than not, the simple ebb of time. Every few years, formaldehyde fails to become an event, an occurrence that, in the words of Badiou, compels us to decide a new way of being, or in this case, a new way of building and dwelling. So at this point in our historical timeline, our geographical and meta-narrative succession sort of converge with formaldehyde. As down here is New Orleans, and formaldehyde really met its event in late 2005 when over 120,000 nearly identical emergency housing units were deployed to the Gulf Coast to house those that were displaced by Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. And they were built on no-bid contracts under rush order with very little quality control. These homes, these FEMA trailers, quickly became infamous and the media sort of portrayed them as just another instance of a bungled federal response. And while emergency production and conditions may have resulted in deviant production practices, the material choices that created the industrialized atmospheres of these trailers was a long time coming, and these trailers are less of a post-disaster aberration than a logical conclusion of late industrial capitalism's recourse to engineered woods at moments of housing crisis that have a regressive exposure structure disproportionately accumulating in smaller domestic airspaces with of the lower classes and those in crisis. So I guess here is where I reveal the secret title of this talk, which is The Making and Unmaking of the FEMA Trailer. So much of the notoriety of the formaldehyde exposure in these FEMA trailers is due to their service in the wake of the costliest natural disaster in U.S. history, a definitive event and a locus of sustained media attention. Their synchronous deployment, relative geographic density, single distributor, and the intoxication of some affluent displaced people garnered further eventfulness, pulling a chemical that hovered in the shadows of the everyday up to the very cusp of eventfulness. And indeed, the FEMA trailers have been a fulcrum upon which legal attempts at redress and regulation have been leveraged. It's also the only space that's ever been regulated by the federal government. So for a matter of years, from 2008 to 2011, only federal emergency housing units had an indoor air quality regulation saying that below 16 parts per billion was the required level of formaldehyde for them to be used. And that's the only indoor air, the domestic residential air quality regulation we've ever had. And it was quietly rescinded in 2011. Let's see. That's right. But as a result of the formaldehyde and the FEMA trailer issues, there was a huge amount of petitioning done by the Sierra Club, and they used this petition to lobby the federal government to reform TSCA to actually regulate not formaldehyde in general, but formaldehyde in certain engineered woods. So they're not actually testing the air quality of homes, but regulating the components that go into these homes. And that is obviously a sort of a regressive environmental regulation, because you can build very different environments with different assemblages of the same product. So you can have far worse air quality if the room was 4 feet less tall. So people with smaller homes are going to be exposed to more. And it was basically, the regulation was set at a limit which was just the most convenient to industry. But it was passed, and Obama signed it into law on June 10th, although it still hasn't yet been implemented. There's a series of controversies related to it. And I guess, yeah, this is a regulation that imagines the world inhaled one commodity at a time, and isn't actually health-based. It actually, even though it uses the FEMA in the petition starts by saying, after Hurricane Katrina, all these people were exposed, we need to do something about it. And even though they use the FEMA trailers as leverage to get this law passed, it's exactly those tiny spaces that this law abandons. And the law was based off of the California Air Resources Board regulation called CARB 2, which was passed in 2009. And I had some long sort of drawn out comments about how this proposed regulation is affecting the formaldehyde industry, and there's a rise in soy. So there's a rise in adhesives that are based on soy, and I think a lot of people are heralding this as a success, and it's sort of discussed as something new, but obviously we know that it's going back to about 100-year-old technology. And it's also exchanging a domestic human exposure for global south environmental issues. The primary plaintiffs of people that own patents for soy engineered wood production are in Brazil. So the release of carbon through destruction of rainforests, and the largest owner of a soy-based adhesive patent is also the largest producer of formaldehyde. So even if we see succession in terms of chemicals, capital does not necessarily follow suit. So the switch from petrochemistry to agrochemistry is not capital and power. I just saved y'all a lot of details. And so some people are jettisoning from formaldehyde and trying soy-based adhesives, but the vast majority are not. Lumber Liquidators, Home Depot, and Lowe's are among the many retailers that supply low-cost laminate flooring made with urea formaldehyde resins. Lumber Liquidators was especially a darling of investors. Between 2012 and 2013, the stock rose 7 times. Not 7 discrete times, but 7-fold, sorry. This increase in 7 times. Trust me with your insurance or your investment futures. This increase in gross profit margins in an extremely, this is also, a great graphic from an article on the rise of formaldehyde as an indoor air problem in China in a Chinese journal, and they just had this beautiful question mark hovering over America as there's no regulation. This is a map of all the different regulations of late industrial countries, and there's just a hovering question mark over America. So back to the increases in profit margins of Lumber Liquidators. So the 7-fold increase caught the attention of Zhuo Zhu in 2013, a 23-year-old Chinese-born dropout of UCLA's finance PhD program. He paid to have Lumber Liquidators flooring that he had purchased in Southern California tested in a Richmond-based lab, and found formaldehyde levels 3.5 times the allowable level, despite it being self-reported as passing these new regulations. Zhuo shorted the stock. Does everyone know what shorting stocks is? Okay. If you don't, okay. All right. So Zhuo shorted the stock and published his expose on the finance website Seeking Alpha. It didn't make a dent in the stock price. Neither did an expose several months later funded by an interesting NGO called the Environmental Investigation Agency that found Lumber Liquidators was importing trees illegally logged from the Far East Russia, and this logging was happening in the habitats of the last remaining Siberian tigers and Amur leopards in the world. The report led to the raiding of Lumber Liquidators headquarters, the first felony conviction under the Lacey Act of 1900, which prohibits trade in the illegal importation of wildlife products, and also a $13 million fine. The report also had little to no impact on the company's stocks, as did the federal investigation, raiding, and fining. It also had no effect on demand. I think that's why there's no effect on the stock. Numerous health complaints from Lumber Liquidators consumers and investor finance testing did not, to my knowledge, spur any investigations by the state of California or the federal government, highlighting the long-known difficulty of environmental enforcement even in relatively well-funded regulatory states such as this one. And it wasn't until this is amazing, the Robin Hood Investors Conference I'll say it again, the Robin Hood Investors Conference of 2013, when so-called activist investor Whitney Tilson of Case Capital, whose slides I'm using right now, he shorted 44,676 shares of Lumber Liquidators stock. And it wasn't until this moment that the market really took notice. Tilson helped finance further tests and pitched the story to 60 Minutes as a means of informing the public about the hazards of laminate flooring. The expose, which aired on March 1st, 2015 on 60 Minutes, sent stocks tumbling by 40% and spurred multiple government interventions and investigations. The factories with the most egregious violations were based in China, but to be clear, this is not a story of tainted Chinese goods. The factories were under investigation. They readily told the American clients that they would save 10 to 15% on all products that were labeled as carb to compliant, but were actually not compliant. So the lumber liquidators was not deceived by the factories, which I think is just want to make that clear. This finance-driven intervention is a new narrative for environmental justice. Both Joao and Tilson's argument emerged not out of community-reported harm, but financial data. They saw externalities and the probably environmental externalities in the profit margin. They were in essence flagging an excess of what Jason Moore calls cheap nature and the capitalization of such an excess. I'm endlessly appreciative of Jason Moore's conceptual work and the optimism in his assertion that capitalism is running on the fumes of a nearly exhausted reservoir of cheap labor power, food, energy, and raw materials. He sees toxicity as a limit, specifically mentioning fracking and the BP oil spill, as indicators that capitalism is now at the dregs of cheap nature. But where he sees exhaustion, I see optimization and financialization. Regulation is not an impediment to capitalism, but a license, a stamina-enhancing pacing, and a political insulation of cheap nature extraction and an immunization against protest. Regulation enables and depoliticizes the cheap nature extraction below a certain threshold, and in the case of formaldehyde, the opportunity for capitalization above such a threshold through speculative finance. Speculative finance is our regulator now, where deep gulps of cheap nature that lead to intoxication are not crises in capitalism, but opportunities for capitalization, enabling a continuance of human subclinical wounding as a sink for toxicants. The injuries that follow from being a human chemical sink is not just an externality, but also supports a highly profitable injury industry. As S. Lachlan Jane reminds us, that injury in the US is, quote, unreservedly saturated in money, end quote. At the level of lawyers, healthcare systems, treating the injured, pharmaceutical companies, and the corporations profiting off of potentially injury-causing cost-cutting measures. So toxicity, in my eyes, is not the final caustic sputter of capitalism running out of options, but merely an increasingly regularized means of profit or price subsidy and capital accrual. So now I'd like to make a rather clumsy transition from juridical, legal, financial means of chemical succession to an altogether different means of conjuring succession. As you'll remember, the regulatory form of TSCA requires industries to be opposed. And as it was, formaldehyde was used so widely, it wasn't clear which industry exactly who should be opposed. So I want to question the logic that sort of underlines these arterial avenues of contestation, being both avenues of science and law, and regulatory science and law. And perhaps it is this oppositional logic that is perhaps in this oppositional logic that the imaginative horizons of a world beyond industrial capitalism are constrained. You can only get so far by pushing off of a world. But with a project as big as late industrialism, achieving escape velocity in this manner appears all but impossible. Toxic infrastructures are made incrementally better or located in communities with the least capacity to fight. Not here. Reduce your use of this chemical, improve your efficiency in that process. All too often, the boots on the ground work of environmental justice and community science that I often participate in is taken up into refinement's industrial process and not reckonings with the unsustainable moorings of these practices. So over the past 6 months, I've been increasingly convincing myself that perhaps the most efficacious means of pursuing an otherwise is via the tools that don't claim efficacy at all. Not through contesting nightmares, but cultivating desires and dream worlds in what I have called alter engineering projects that are often artist-led. The goal here is not to contest a problem, but to create a space of extraterritoriality that gains its power by the gradual abandonment of normative dreams. Not so good at advancing slides. There we go. The answer. Just that easy. Balloons. Joking. One such project I'm working on with a Berlin-based artist named Tomas Saraceno is this. The project is called the Aeroscene and revolves around air-solar flight, which is the only means of going up without drilling down. It is the only hydrocarbon-free vehicle for aerospace travel. Unlike hot air balloons, which are actually more energy intensive than cars, the burners for this solar balloon is the sun. The balloons are just extremely lightweight and sealed envelopes, often made from trash, that are tetrahedral in shape and gain loft by being heated by the sun or heated by infrared radiation from the Earth. The Earth is sort of like a big battery that releases infrared radiation throughout the night. They travel with the wind wherever it goes. The dream worlds of the Aeroscene do not run on the technological domination and continued appropriation of cheap nature. Rather, the project begins by attuning to and moving with the forces that animate our planet, more of a calculated and informed submission to global forces than a mastery over them. Conceiving of the wind and solar rays as critical infrastructures for the ongoing present demands that our desires be re-engineered through forgotten supply chains, the planet's shared and circulating atmosphere. These currents of interest The currents of interest are not merely the aerial flows that propelled a nautical yesteryear, but multiple overlapping, dynamic, and sometimes counter-current atmospheric strata that have only recently become mappable in 3 dimensions. So this is a slice of the atmosphere looking horizontally over the plane of the globe, and you'll see that the yellow and the blue are aerial currents that are flowing actually in different directions at different heights. So if you can control up and down in a balloon, you can actually control which winds that you can catch to actually go the direction that you'd want to go to. So in this way, the Aeroscene denotes an epoch of slippery temporalities, of past becoming future and futures becoming present. The vision of this project is not undergirded by restorative nostalgia for a romanticized non-technological past, but a reflective nostalgia that pulls centuries-old technologies and the fabulations of science fiction into the same frame. As balloons were already wistful novelties during the 19th century, and solar balloons have not yet been fully realized for flight, tense begins to break loose when trying to locate the Aeroscene. It is a chronotrope without golden spikes, the golden spikes of terrestrial eras, one that's movement is already enjoyed by avian, fungal, insect, and bacterial species that regularly cruise within atmospheric currents. Part of the reason that I like talking about this project over the DIY monitoring and mitigation projects that I began the talk with is that the ethical import of this project emerges from its very instability. Aerosolar flight is the least reliable way to fly. You have to wait for the sun to be out and for the wind to be low at the altitude that you're launching from. We fly when the milieu of global forces align, and we do not use engineering to duratively interrupt, manipulate, and overcome these forces, but to strategically submit to them to become what Dominique Boyer and Timothy Mitchell have recently begun calling hyposubjects, to oppose to the hypersubjects of the Anthropocene, Capitalocene, Plantationocene. So this is an intervention not at the molecular level. It is not chemical species specific, as a regulation would be. It does not ask for a pollution source to be reduced. It does not make a claim through a process of adjudication that privileges certain forms of knowledge, but it goes upstream and is an intervention into the very desires that produce a world where cheap natural gas extraction is then the feedstock for cheap formaldehyde. It establishes an alternative way of moving, making, and being with elemental forces, and perhaps every aeroscenic balloon flight voyage is a humble step towards weaning off of mine deposits and extinguishing the human and ecological impacts of a world engineered around hydrocarbon extraction. So this is in no way a solution, but it's an opportunity to think differently about our subjectivities and our engineering practices in in relationship to world ecologies, and to potentially buck the assumption of industrial capitalism, namely that the practices and infrastructures that beckoned our present environmental crises can also get us out of it. Another way of putting this would be, it establishes a destination for environmentalist dreams that bristle with critique of the present, but are rightfully very wary of roosting amongst the viable futures touted by industry. So here's some flights. And of course, this does always go back to regulation. One of the main problems with flying lighter than aircraft is that fossil fuel-based airplanes sort of own a certain strata of the sky, and you can't, over a certain weight, go in that airspace. There's this petition that Thomas has been wielding for several years to change the regulation so that lighter than aircraft would have right-of-way. And that's actually the law of the sea, where sailboats have priority over fossil fuel-powered vessels. So we were at even though I say that this is not a solution, we were part of the COP21 Solutions Conference. And and the serious talk has already ended, but this is sort of the alternative ending. And you can see here in the background, here's an Aerosine balloon sort of menacing the reformist, greenwash technologies that were the mainstay of the COP21 Solutions Conference. And there was someone in the rafters that had to stay in the rafters all day to adjust the pressure inside the balloon because the sun was coming through the glass and heating the balloon. So someone had to release the pressure as the sun would go, so that the balloons would not Willy Wonka through the roof. And so this brings us back to the arcade, and my hope was actually to sabotage that release valve and have the balloons destroy the roof of the Grand Palais as a final act of defiance. But I guess we can just leave it as imagining that. So.